Dr. Ling.
Hi.
How are you?
Doing good. Hanging in there.
Let me ask you a basic question. I feel like most people recognize that nicotine is highly addictive. And I don't want to overstate this, but I think it's one of the most addictive, right? I mean, some say even more addictive than heroin, for example. Heroin may be more destructive, although that's even questionable. But nicotine is one of the most addictive substances on the planet. Do young people recognize that?
I think young people do recognize that nicotine is addictive, but
That addictive.
Yeah, but I think the tobacco companies have been on a campaign since the 1988 Surgeon General's report came out that said nicotine is addictive, right? Nicotine is the reason why people can't quit smoking. And the tobacco companies have been on a campaign for 50 plus years to try to minimize nicotine and say, nicotine is like caffeine in your coffee. It's not a big deal. And actually that minimizing the seriousness of nicotine addiction is pretty deeply offensive to people who've struggled with nicotine addiction. It's true that there are people who say, I decided to quit, and they just quit. But when you take care of patients who, continue to smoke even though they've had their larynx removed, or continue to smoke even though they have cancer because they can't quit, you're talking about a really serious addiction. And that, I think, young people are maybe sort of aware of it, but there is an active campaign to get them to forget about it.
Sticking with the basics, nicotine versus tobacco. So what are they? What's the difference?
So tobacco is the plant that grows, and nicotine is the addictive substance that is found in tobacco.
And tobacco is what is associated with lung cancer and lung diseases and things like that.
Right. So the particularly smoking cigarettes, right? So when you take tobacco leaves and you cure them and you make them into cigarettes and you smoke them, that is the use of tobacco that's associated with, or that causes lung cancer. Actually, the Surgeon General says it causes lung cancer and heart disease, and, that kills 490,000 people in the U.S. every year.
So I think that's well established. And this is going back to C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General who got these warning labels put on cigarettes. But now let's talk about nicotine in isolation. So nicotine is a component of tobacco. In and of itself, what is the harm of nicotine?
Right. Well, we know less about the direct harms of nicotine. The thing we know the most is that nicotine is definitely addictive, because
caffeine addictive, or it's addictive, and I realize one of the most addictive substances on the planet. But in terms of harm,
yeah, people have said nicotine addiction is as strong, if not stronger, than things like heroin or cocaine. So it is as addictive as some of the harder drugs that we talk about.
If you use nicotine every day your whole life, not tobacco, but if you use nicotine every day, what would happen to you? What's the problem?
Yeah, well, we know that we don't think that nicotine causes cancer the way that smoking tobacco causes lung cancer, but people who use nicotine nicotine use is associated with mental health problems. It is a vasoconstrictor. If you have cancer, it's a tumor promoter. And there has been some studies that it can cause cancer in animals, but not humans. And nicotine withdrawal is, especially for young people, nicotine withdrawal symptoms are pretty severe. And so people will say that they can't sleep, they can't eat, they can't focus. They have a lot of trouble with anxiety and mental health challenges when they try to stop using nicotine.
I want to get a sort of snapshot of where we are as a country with regard to nicotine and tobacco use. I just want to read you some numbers and correct me if any of these numbers are wrong. But teen cigarette smoking peaked in the late 1990s when 37% of teens at that point reported smoking. By 2021, that number had fallen to just 3.9%. But in the 2010s, after cigarettes were already in steep decline, vaping. It was already there, but it really started to surge in popularity, peaking in 2019 when about 5 million teens were using e-cigarettes. So you seem like you had two things happening simultaneously. Cigarette smoking dropped precipitously among teenagers, but at the same time, vaping increased significantly in popularity. So what are we to make of all that? What was the impact of all that?
Yeah, so we did have big decreases in teen smoking. You're right, over the decades. I think the numbers that you're quoting sound right to me. And we actually, long before vapes came out, right, we were having dramatic declines in teen smoking because we had national campaigns, we had warning labels, we had taxes on cigarettes. We had clean indoor air laws, so there were lots of things happening in the U.S. to drive down those smoking rates. And then e-cigarettes were introduced, and actually teen smoking continued to decline, but at a slower rate after that. And then we had this big increase in vaping that peaked around 2019, as you say. So I don't think it's true that teen smoking dropped because of vaping, because it was already going down. But now, by far, the most popular tobacco product used by young people is vaping.
And do you anticipate, as a result of this, that teen smoking may go back up? Is there a transition point between vaping and starting to smoke again?
That is one of our concerns. So there have been longitudinal studies of young people who are vaping, and they really consistently find that teens that vape are about 3 times more likely to start smoking later in their life. So we are concerned that the popularity of vaping could lead to a resurgence of smoking.
I have 3 teenagers, by the way. I'll preface by saying that. They're all girls, so I think I know my kids pretty well, and I don't think vaping is a problem. But, look, one thing I say to parents all the time is you need to be intentional about having these conversations with your kids because you never know. And some of these vaping devices are designed to be concealed. They're designed to be hidden from parents, teachers, and others alike. So, I hope anyone listening to the podcast today could have an intentional, honest conversation with their kids about vaping and listen to you about the potential harms. But what is the harm then of vaping? So what are they vaping, first of all? It's nicotine?
Yes, most vapes contain nicotine and in a solvent, which is like a propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin solvent, but that's the liquid that is contained in vapes. And so it's not tobacco leaf. It usually is this kind of liquid that's heated up with a battery device and inhaled. Yeah.
Do you have any sense of what percentage of vapes are things other than nicotine, like cannabis and other things?
I don't think we exactly know, but what we do know, especially in places where they've legalized cannabis, is that the number of devices, just because the people who make vapes have kind of learned from each other. So the nicotine vapes and the cannabis vapes look really similar, and I think they use a lot of the same electronics and the same technology. So if you're searching around on the internet for vapes, you're really likely to come up with cannabis vapes or nicotine vapes, and sometimes it can be really hard to tell what you're getting. And so I think it used to be for cannabis, people smoked weed, right? Back in the olden days. And now cannabis vaping has really become much more popular, kind of in parallel with the popularity of nicotine vapes.
Before I get into the real harms of this, which I think for a lot of people may be intuitive, but there is a success story in here, again, in terms of how much teen smoking did drop over the couple of decades. And you said it was several things. It was indoor air laws, regulations. It was warning labels on cigarettes. What do you attribute it to more than anything? Is there something that sort of stands out as a lesson learned in terms of really bringing down teen smoking?
I mean, in the U.S., we had some of the most effective mass media campaigns to educate young people about the dangers of smoking. So probably before your kids' time was the Truth Campaign, which is now run by the Truth Initiative. But this campaign started in the 90s, right? Why I like it is because it really, rather than telling teens that this cigarette smoke is going to kill you, the campaign was really focused on holding tobacco executives responsible for their role in perpetuating a lie to the American public about the dangers of smoking. So you may have remembered they had these ads where you would have teenagers bringing a lie detector to the Philip Morris offices to like interrogate the CEO of Philip Morris, because when they were doing the research for this campaign, they found out that like teens did not really care that much about getting lung cancer 50 years from now, right? What they cared about was adults lying and getting away with it and making money off of their lies, because teens can relate to adults not following the rules that they themselves are subject to. So that energy around saying, the tobacco industry is responsible for this. They've been lying. They've been making all this money off of it. And you as teens can actually hold these adults accountable for their actions, was the core message of the Truth Campaign in the 90s. And that was actually very relatable and energizing for rebellious teens who have the highest rates of youth smoking.
I find this really interesting because I think in some ways, again, we're both doctors, but the idea of effective communication, I think for a lot of doctors, people who went to medical school, it's this idea that, look, if you don't do this, this may happen to you. If you don't exercise, you don't eat right, you may get heart disease, you may develop problems later in life. But this point that you're making, that you've made a couple times now, is you've got to understand what's really going to resonate with people. So for these young people, imagining lung cancer 50 years from now, bad, but not immediate enough to maybe spur them to action. But the idea that these tobacco executives were taking advantage of them in some way, lying to them in some way, that was enough to spur action.
Yeah, so it is more thinking like a marketer, right? And it's a little less thinking about it. In medicine, we tend to be very logical and very much like if you give people the facts, they'll respond, they'll learn, and they'll change their behavior, which is true. But sometimes the facts you need to share are not just changing your individual behavior. Sometimes getting people energized about, we need to hold this industry accountable. We need to ask not why people smoke. We need to ask, why are these tobacco products so available? Why are they so cheap? Why is it so much easier to get cigarettes than to get a counselor for mental health? And sometimes asking those questions and holding the industry accountable for creating an environment that makes it so easy for people to make choices that are bad for their health is a better message.
I think we'll come back to that again. I think that's really important. I think maybe more important than ever, just in terms of everything that's going on with public health, to really learn some of those lessons and apply them in effective ways. Going back to vaping nicotine. So you had a vape, it has nicotine in it, and I think you said propylene glycol, which is the compound, I guess, that heats up.
Right, it's like a solvent. So it's usually a
solvent.
mixture of propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin is most commonly the solvents used.
So what do we know now over the last couple of decades in terms of the potential harms associated with this?
Well, there are some health harms associated with vaping for young people, particularly for if young people have asthma, it can exacerbate asthma. It is associated with respiratory problems. There are now some studies of young people who only vape and who don't smoke cigarettes, who have changes in their oral mucosa that look like precursors to cancer. So there is some concern about exposure to carcinogens from either the nicotine or the solvents, inhaling the aerosol. So it's not water vapor, right? When people say vaping, it's actually this complex mix of chemicals.
What can we say conclusively at this point about harms from vaping?
I think the biggest harm from vaping is really exposing yourself to an addictive substance, which is the nicotine. So while the nicotine doesn't cause cancer, the nicotine is very addictive and can then lead you to move on to other tobacco products. And it's not a trivial thing. So people who are addicted to nicotine, then experience, especially, you have teenage girls, so I do too. The mental health challenges in teen girls is like a real thing. And adding nicotine addiction to someone who's already trying to navigate, strong and complex emotions or anxiety, depression, stress, that is a really bad combination for young people.
Does it raise your blood pressure or does it have an impact on your cardiovascular system?
It is a vasoconstrictor. Yeah. So
it may raise your heart rate and your blood
yes.
pressure.
Yes. And we also know that And there have been studies looking at exposure to the cardiovascular effects of exposure to the nicotine-containing aerosols compared to cigarette smoke, and there are studies that show that they're the same.
That's interesting, because I was going to ask if there was any redeeming qualities to vaping, because I think when, they started to really become quite popular, I think one of the things that they were touted as doing was helping people quit smoking.
Yes, and actually there is now better evidence than before that there are some randomized controlled trials that show that when you give people vapes and counseling in a randomized controlled trial situation, they do quit smoking at rates equal to or a little bit better than nicotine replacement therapy. So there is some good RCT evidence that nicotine vapes can help people quit smoking. The problem is that, life is not a randomized trial, right? So the highly controlled conditions that we do for RCTs are not like go down to 7-Eleven, get a Geek Bar, and do the best you can. And that's what people are mostly using vapes. And we have lots of population-based studies because they let these products on the market before the RCTs were done, right? We have huge longitudinal cohorts of the population of people actually using vapes to try to quit smoking. And the longitudinal population studies show that people actually don't quit at higher rates. And in some cases, they actually are less likely to quit if they're using vapes.
Quit at higher rates compared to, you mean, other nicotine replacement?
Compared to people who didn't use vapes, yeah.
I see. So they weren't. So where do we land on this then? Because I think, again, the redeeming quality, if there was one, of vaping was that it can help people quit smoking. Now that we're in 2025, was that a failed experiment? Did it work? Well, how would you describe it?
I would say that you potentially can use vapes to quit smoking, but it needs to be in a very controlled environment, right? You need to have counseling, you need to have a doctor's supervision, you need to have really close follow-up the way you would give a medication, right? The problem is many more people in the population as a commercial product, this is a failure because the highest rates of use are by young people. Now, most of the young people using vapes have never smoked cigarettes, so they're just an entry point into nicotine addiction. And the real-world way that people are mostly using vapes isn't effective for cessation.
Are we doing enough as a society in terms of regulation around vaping?
I think we could do more.
Because correct me, so the flavors were a big concern, and it seemed like a lot of flavors were sort of designed to be attractive to young people. I mean, watermelon and bubble gum and flavors like that. Some of those have gone away. Is that right? And I think menthol was still allowed to exist, but just give us a little bit of the landscape in terms of where the regulation is.
Yeah, so you're right. There were concerns about flavors because over 80% of young people who start with flavored tobacco products, including vapes. When the vaping epidemic was at its peak in 2018, 2019, that was really driven by the product called Juul, a little one that looked like a USB port. Juul voluntarily withdrew their flavors except for mint and menthol. And tobacco flavor. So some of the products that had the most scrutiny got rid of some of the flavors. But if you
and they did that voluntarily, you said?
They voluntarily did that, I think, to avoid like having flavors be banned across the board. But what you see if you look on the marketplace, or if you just if you like go online and look around, is that there are still hundreds to thousands of e-cigarette products available in a wide variety of flavors because those products they're officially under the auspices of the FDA. The FDA does have authority to regulate vapes, but these, I think, are technically illegal, but they're just, it's just very difficult to enforce, and there are just tons and tons of flavored products still really easily available. They're also now getting much bigger and stronger. So Juul really dominated the market because they put salts, they put acids into their liquid, which allowed them to deliver a lot of nicotine. And a Juul pod had about 200 puffs in it, which was the equivalent of a pack of cigarettes worth of nicotine. Now you can get vapes that contain 6,000 puffs, 10,000 puffs, so they're like 20 times stronger than what was in a Juul pod, and you can buy them for $10 or certainly under 20, and so you can walk around with like a couple of cartons worth of nicotine, in your handheld device. And the problem for young people is that you often don't know how much nicotine is in the vape, and because you can kind of stealthily use it all day long and in different situations without realizing it, you can become very addicted to the nicotine.
You and I both have teenagers, sounds like.
Yeah.
By the way,
too.
My oldest is 20 now, so I guess she's no longer a teenager. Hard to believe.
So is mine.
Oh, really? Okay. So we're at that
Developmentally, though, still teenagers.
Yeah, right. Doesn't change overnight, as it turns out. But what do you say to teenagers who might be listening then, who say, hey, look, it's not smoking. I'm not getting tobacco. I feel like I get a little boost when I'm trying to study. It helps me stay awake, helps me focus. What do you say to those teenagers?
Yeah, I think the fact if you're able to have a conversation with your teen about it and they're actually telling you they're using it, that is a win. Because most of the time, like, parents aren't even aware, and they're just like, why is my kid so crampy? What is going on?
But is that you said that twice now? So crankiness, just bad mood? What is that?
I think that, so when you talk to people who are trying to quit vaping, right, or quit smoking, right, the most common things people will complain about is there's physical symptoms of having headaches, but lousy mood, short temper, just not being able to concentrate. So it's almost like people think nicotine's helping them concentrate, but actually what they're experiencing is nicotine, like relieving nicotine withdrawal.
Interesting.
Right? We heard that from people who smoke too. So maybe initially you feel like you get a little boost, but really rapidly because because nicotine changes your brain. This is how I talk to young people. It's like, nicotine changes the receptors in your brain and makes you want more and more. So you very quickly go from getting a little boost to not feeling normal without it, right? And that's really where the bad things come in.
So a lot of parents may be listening now and thinking, okay, I'm a little scared because, I'd love to have these conversations with my kids, but I'm not sure that they're being totally honest about their vape usage. Are there any? Obviously you mentioned, mood and how that might change, being aware of those sorts of signs. Are there other things that can help parents sort of figure out in a respectful way? I'm not saying spy on your kids, but I'm just saying trying to figure out like if they might be vaping.
Yeah, you can ask your kids, maybe not specifically about them, but you can ask them like if they've seen at their school what's happening with vaping. Do they have friends who are vaping? Sometimes you can get kids to talk about what they've just noticed in their lives. And, they might be like, oh, Dad, I'm not doing this, but, my friend so-and-so is high all the time, right? And so it just gives you a little bit of a sense of like what's going on in their social circles, right? And what's normal, and at least having that conversation where they feel like they can tell you like about what their friends are doing or what they're seeing happening at school. Because your kids will tell you, right? They took all the doors off the stalls in the bathroom because there was so much vaping.
Yep.
Right. And you can at least be curious and say, tell me about that. Like, what are people doing? Parents can also, you can go online and you can look at there are some educational things for parents to like be able to recognize like these things, because the vapes have a very huge amount of variation in the size, the color, the shape. They can be disguised to look like boba or drinks or video games and hidden in the sleeves of your sweatshirt and stuff. So I think it's hard to be on top of all the things, but having some genuine interest in like what your kids are doing and experiencing, I think can be a start to a conversation. And then I do think expressing real concerns about, I'm always like, it's the same thing when you try to tell your teenager like not to be on their phone all the time. You're like, I understand that, this is how you're communicating with your friends, but also we know this is not good for your mental health. Right. And we're trying to support you. but it's challenging.
It's challenging, and these devices are designed to be concealed. I mean, that was another thing. It's like, they want people to be able to hide this. I think I saw another interview that you did where you mentioned, unlike cigarette smoke, which is really obvious, you can smell it, but with vaping, you might smell something too, right? It might be a sweet smell or something, like if you walk.
It smells kind of like cotton candy-ish. Sometimes people say it smells like cotton candy, but teens will say like, oh, we just lit a candle, right? But
right.
It smells a little bit like a scented candle sometimes. It doesn't smell aversive, which is again a challenge for parents to figure out.
Did this problem get worse during the pandemic?
I think it was kind of plus minus in the pandemic, because for young people, a lot of young people got vapes at school and from their friends. And so when everybody had to stay home, it cut off the supply for some young people who were really using social sources. On the other hand, I think people who either had continued to have access to vapes with the kind of mental health challenges and the stresses around the pandemic, I think that for some, use did go up or increase because of that.
I mean, again, I think if there's any good news, I like to celebrate good news. So if there's any good news here, I think that the vaping sort of surged in popularity, peaking, it seemed like right in 2019, so just before the pandemic. And at that point, they say about 5 million teens were using vapes or e-cigarettes. By the way, I think these numbers are really hard to come by because, again, for all the reasons you mentioned earlier, much of this is self-report. And I mean, a lot of kids are just not going to admit it. So these could be undercounts. But nevertheless, trend-wise, it seemed like it surged around 2019. And by 2024 has dropped to about a third of that peak, which was the lowest level in a decade. So potentially some good news there. But at the same time, a new product sort of emerged. I'm not even sure how to say this. ZYN? How do you say that? Zyn?
Yes. Oh, the nicotine pouches. Yes.
The nicotine pouches.
Yeah, these pouches that contain nicotine. Yes. And Zyn is the most popular brand.
Is that just the way it is, Doc? Like every time we sort of start to get a handle on one product, another one comes along?
I will tell you that is the tobacco company's plans. So we talked about in the beginning about the tobacco industry. 20 years ago, the cigarette companies said, we have a problem. People are quitting smoking. How do we stay alive as a business? And their plan was basically to transform themselves into like nicotine pharmaceutical companies. And so all of this rolling out the next new products, whether they're heated tobacco products, e-cigarettes, nicotine pouches, other smokeless products. I mean, some tobacco companies also own nicotine replacement therapy pharmaceuticals, because as long as they get people addicted to nicotine and they can keep producing a new product, right, they're still making money. So it's not a surprise that as vaping drops off in popularity, the nicotine pouches are coming up, because there's a whole arsenal of new products that are rolling out to keep people using nicotine and addicted to nicotine, along with these campaigns to say it's not a big deal, right? Maybe it's good for you. Don't worry about it. It's not lit on fire. But
it's cool, whatever it might be.
Yeah, nicotine pouch is really easy to hide. Right?
Really easy to hide.
They look like candy.
And so much of this used to be sort of TV advertisements, and now the other thing that has changed tremendously is social media. Has that surprised you, just sort of the rise of nicotine pouches?
I was a little surprised because, we've had smokeless tobacco products in this country for a long time, and they've never been very popular because smokeless tobacco is pretty disgusting. And also, chewing tobacco, right? Like that's been around forever, but it's never been, so sticking tobacco in your cheek, right? It's never been, it's been popular among like young men, macho young guys, but
yes,
for like women and other people, it's like disgusting. And so for a while, the nicotine pouches were kind of associated with chew, and they were like kind of disgusting. But now, because they're more like the companies that are promoting the nicotine pouches, a lot of them are vape companies. So they're kind of using all of the techniques that made vapes popular and translating even some of the same brands over to the pouches. And I think that's opened up the market or the audience for the pouches to people who are not chewing tobacco users, who are like, oh, you know what, I'm I'm going to get my nicotine some other way. They get addicted to vaping, and then they try going to the pouches to either quit vaping or to try to keep getting nicotine in a way that's, again, easily concealable, and that still has flavors. I think the popularity has been in part because they disassociated from chew and they associated with vapes.
But it is interesting what you're pointing out, that many of these products, whether they be vaping or even tobacco products or pouches, may be owned by the same companies. So the same conglomerate.
The tobacco companies own one of all of those. So the tobacco companies are still making money. The concern I have about pouch is not only is the concealability, but they're also getting bigger and stronger. So even like the pouches you can buy this year compared to last year, the milligrams of nicotine. So when we prescribe nicotine replacement, the low dose is 2 milligrams and the high dose is 4 milligrams, right? Zyn starts at 3 and has 6. So it already starts out stronger than nicotine replacement.
I really resist being preachy at all in life, and certainly on this podcast. But what would you say to parents who? Because I do talk to parents whose kids are vaping, and the parents know it. And sometimes I get this sense, doctor, that they are kind of like, just let them. Like, what am I? It seems insurmountable for them. Nicotine's so addictive, and then kids go off to college and you don't have eyes on them all the time. And I think it's frightening, but I think there's almost this sense of like despair, like there's nothing I can do about it. What would you say to those parents?
I would say there's always something you can do, right? So you can talk to your kids, but also, what parents can do? Parents can do things like put in public comment to the FDA.
Yeah, I think parents definitely have a voice. And if you're talking to your kid one-on-one, the way we started this conversation was this idea that what we've learned from big tobacco marketing was that they were selling a product by extolling the virtues of it, obviously not emphasizing the harms. If you reverse engineer that message as a parent talking to a kid, is the message, hey, imagine your life without vaping. Imagine your life without these nicotine pouches, as opposed to saying, hey, this is so bad for you. Is there a different approach, do you think, in terms of that conversation that parents should be having with their kids that would be more effective in getting them to quit?
There might be, right? It might be for some young people knowing the harms, right? Like if they don't know the harms, you might have to do some education about the harms. But for some young people, right, the harms of what they're doing is not going to be the thing that resonates, right? So it might be, yes, focusing on the positive thing that they do want and seeing how, vaping or using pouches interferes with that. Or thinking about, a different reason that might not even be health related. Sometimes when we get kids involved in these campaigns that are anti-industry, they will quit smoking or vaping on their own, even not for health reasons. They'll just say, I'm really passionate about this, and I just feel like it's not the right thing to do because, I'm part of this campaign. And so sometimes just getting people, making a real connection with your kids, no judgment, and helping them to connect with things that have meaning and that are incompatible sometimes with the behavior can be more effective.
And hey, look, these campaigns have worked in the past. And we can end the podcast there. There's been some good news, right, in terms of the effectiveness of these campaigns. Maybe we learned it from big tobacco initially, but it doesn't mean that it can't be applied for good.
That's right. And we can do more.
Can always do more. Hey, I was really looking forward to this. I watched some of your other interviews that you've done. We're both parents, and I think that this is something that a lot of parents are thinking about. So really appreciate your guidance. Thank you.
For sure. It's been a pleasure.